It's very difficult to communicate to either geographic pole, North Pole or South Pole, even using satellites. Typically, the satellite communication systems would involve geostationary satellites which cannot even see above 81 degrees latitude, so they can't see the poles at 90 degrees latitude. However, when these communication satellites get old enough, sometimes their orbit plane drifts. Instead of being over the equator, it starts to drift off the equator, and at one end you can see the North Pole, and later on in the day you can see the South Pole for a few hours each day, depending on how much it's drifted. And because of this, in 1984, I was able to establish the first satellite phone call from the South Pole through a now geosynchronous ATS-3 satellite. It's an old NASA satellite that was launched in 1967, and here in 1984 it was still working. So we took a VHF communication system to the South Pole, set it up, and did the first phone call from the pole to Goddard Space Flight Center through ATS-3 on December 15th, 1984. Talked for about 45 minutes. Then, 15 years later, when I was at the North Pole, I had a Iridium satellite telephone in my hand. It was a little different scenario. At that time, there was a global constellation of low Earth orbiting satellites, 66 satellites in all. And if you had a little handheld satellite phone, you could actually talk to the satellite nearest you. It would relay the data among all the different satellites until it got to one over the area of your caller, at the other end of your phone call, and download to them. And if somebody at the South Pole had an Iridium satellite phone, we could have had a direct conversation. Of course, in April of 1999, nobody at the South Pole had one of those yet. It was too new. But what they did have was they did have a modem connection to a TDRS satellite, just like ATS, only a little newer version of something that we put in a few years later. And when the TDRS satellite was over the South Pole, for those 4 hours a day, we made a phone call from the North Pole, and they could receive it at the South Pole. It became the first pole-to-pole phone call. We connected through Marshall Space Flight Center first, so they could establish a conference call, not only with the North and South Pole, with NASA at the North Pole, National Science Foundation at the South Pole, but in between we had some people from the NASA headquarters and a school in Pennsylvania, and we carried on a 45-minute conversation at the time.